so much, Dr. Edwards. Thank you to the Humanities Center for having us. Thank you to Julian for being here. Glad to see you all. Just before we begin, I'd like to quickly shout out the Center for Latino, Latina, and Latin American Studies here at Wayne State and Words Without Walls at Chatham University in Pittsburgh. These are two very different programs who serve different students, but they both have been extremely supportive of my work and kind of fundamentally shaped me as a teacher and scholar. We're going to talk about both of these programs later in the presentation, but I just wanted to say thank you before we get started. So this is a chapter of my dissertation and it's a work in progress. So I'm going to really quickly here drop an online version in the chat that you can comment on if you so desire. And just so you know, I'm actually going to be speaking for the majority of the presentation, but Julian will be coming in at about the 20-minute mark. So let me drop that in the chat real quick. Here we go. All right. So hope everybody can everybody see that? We good? Thumbs up. Everybody got the link? Great. Okay. So when I first started teaching in Allegheny County Jail, I had no idea what I was doing. I came into my MFA in creative writing at Chatham University in Pittsburgh, an idealistic and angry young man who believed that artists and teachers of all kinds had a responsibility to achieve social and economic justice, but I did not know where to put that energy. So I wrote poems. I tried some community involvement. I went to protests. I joined political organizations. I also took my privileged white body up a hill to Chatham to learn about Adrian Rich, sonnets, and how to order poems in mansions that used to house robber barons. It wasn't until the summer between my first and second year of study that I began to understand the stakes of what I was pursuing and the potential for radical possibility it offered. The MFA at Chatham University offers a unique program called Words Without Walls. Through this program, MFA students take up a teaching placement in a rehabilitation center, jail, or prison. I ended up teaching for 3 semesters in Allegheny County Jail, 2 men's classes and 1 women's class. The experience was transformative both for me and for the students. I could go on and on about the beautiful things my students wrote, the important work we did, and the impact we had on one another. Important to this presentation, however, were my realizations of an abolitionist perspective and the importance of storytelling, which have stayed with me past that experience and into my teaching today. One of my colleagues once quipped to me that anyone who has ever walked into a prison or jail of their own free will almost immediately becomes an abolitionist. I can attest to this. From the moment I walked into Allegheny County Jail, I hated it deeply in my bones. But what drew out that hate and turned it into something more constructive was the experience of being in class with those men and women. Yes, we talked about narrative poetry, rhyme, and ekphrasis, but what was far more important was the chance for my students to tell their stories, to share a human connection in a place intentionally designed to isolate, punish, and discipline. Of course, I didn't have a methodology, theory, or explanation for how I knew that this stuff worked. I just did it, wrote my poems, continued to be angry, and graduated. It wasn't until I started reading more in the field and participating as a PhD candidate in rhetoric and writing studies here at Wayne that I came to better understand theories and methodologies of abolition and storytelling. Of course, this was also through direct practice. For the last year, I've had the privilege of teaching a stretch program of basic writing, introductory college writing, and community writing with the Center for Latino, Latina, and Latin American Studies here at Wayne State. Since 1971, the center, as it's called, has remained a steadfast support for Detroit and the surrounding communities through a multifaceted mission of student services programs, Latino, Latinx advocacy on campus, community outreach, and research. Obviously, these students are very different from the adults I taught in Allegheny County Jail, but I found similar successes in my composition classrooms through this abolitionist perspective and the emphasis on storytelling I started with in Allegheny County Jail. In this presentation, I will explain my abolitionist perspective and the kind of storytelling strategies I've developed through trial and error as a teacher and by way of reading the dreaded critical race theory. I will then discuss my thoughts about the historical role of developmental writing, which is called basic writing here at Wayne State, my position as a basic writing instructor, and how teaching in this kind of classroom can serve the goals of abolitionist teaching. Next, you will hear a counter story that Julian and I wrote together that deals with incarceration and our encounters with the police. Finally, I will explain how teaching counter story highlights an abolitionist perspective for students and can potentially result in the kind of solidarity necessary to enact change. So now to kind of get into defining some of these keywords I've been using: abolition, critical race theory, and counter story. Recently, abolition has become something of a buzzword in academic and popular circles, no doubt owing to the increasingly large uprisings against racial injustice in this country, from Ferguson to Minneapolis, from Michael Brown and George Floyd. Of course, the fight against this injustice has been carrying on for hundreds of years by those subjected to chattel slavery and other forms of oppression. White people such as myself started calling ourselves abolitionists in the 17th century, when Quakers and Enlightenment thinkers began to object to slavery on moral grounds. Over time, calling oneself an abolitionist has come to take on different meanings, such as abolishing the police, prisons, and so on. These are important struggles that abolitionists are obligated to take on outside the classroom, but the carceral state and its logics have penetrated our educational system too. While I am committed to other forms of abolition, as an instructor, I can also work against what's called the educational survival complex, which Bettina Love describes in We Want to More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching and the Pursuit of Educational Freedom. Essentially, educational reform has not offered effective solutions to academic inequity, but has instead resulted in us teaching students to improve in high-stakes standardized testing, assessments, grades, and character education. If students of color are to not just survive, not just learn skills and be pushed out the door, we need a kind of educational praxis that demands the impossible, a complete reevaluation of the overarching structures of our society along with our individual teaching practice. So while I can think of quite a few material large-scale ways students of color could be helped, such as open admissions, universal free public college, and resources allocated to ethnic studies departments for a start, I do not think that we can solve these issues in a single presentation. So I will focus instead on what it means to be an abolitionist teacher, something Love defines as the practice of working in solidarity with communities of color while drawing on the imagination, creativity, refusal, remembering, visionary thinking, healing, rebellious spirit, boldness, determination, and subversiveness of abolitionists to eradicate injustice in and outside of schools. To be an abolitionist teacher then is to work in solidarity with communities of color, draw upon the rich history of abolitionist work, and root out injustice. Now, while Love herself certainly has great ideas for how to enact abolitionist teaching in the classroom, it makes sense as a composition instructor to turn to Asia Martinez, whose work, Counterstory, the Rhetoric and Writing of Critical Race Theory, brings the critical race theory methodology of counterstory to composition studies. Love and Martinez share intellectual roots in critical race theory, an approach that is currently being debated in our unending culture war, So just for now, simply put, critical race theory to me acknowledges and challenges the centrality of racism in our society and seeks to combat it through things like interdisciplinarity, intersectionality, experiential knowledge, and a commitment to social justice. While Martinez does not explicitly mention abolition in her work, the connections to abolitionist teaching are obvious, especially when she describes CRT, critical race theory methodology. It recognizes that experiential knowledge of people of color is legitimate and critical to understanding racism that is often well disguised in the rhetoric of normalized structural values and practices. This specific objective of sharing experiential knowledge can lead to a better understanding of racism, which in turn can create solidarity and allow for opportunities to correct injustices, which is something we will return to later on. Martinez draws on several models from critical race theory to develop counterstory as a methodology, one of which is Patricia J. Williams and her use of autobiographical reflection. Like many of the progenitors of critical race theory, Patricia J. Williams is a legal scholar who applied autobiographical reflection to understanding law. Martinez discusses Williams's methodology from The Alchemy of Race and Rights, Diary of a Mad Law Professor. Quote, Williams herself has described her counterstory approach as a method that bridges the traditional gap between theory and praxis to present a text that is multi-layered, that encompasses the straightforwardness of life and reveals the complexity of meaning. These reflections' emphasis on the everyday can reveal the implications of day-to-day racism, layers of history, and seemingly insignificant and mundane transformations. Later, Martinez demonstrates autobiographic reflection through 3 different diary entries that involve her personal experiences of racism from a school peace officer, a security guard, and an HR clerk. All of these entries reveal the inability of traditional academic research to understand the everyday racism people of color face and how we might begin to change it. This is because traditional academic research is relational insofar as it is an ongoing conversation between different researchers, scholars, and students. Scholars and teachers, sorry. Martinez changes this schema through CRT methodology, which explores a different kind of relational scholarship, one in which students and teachers can put their heads together, talk openly about racism, from structural issues to something as mundane and everyday as a writing journal assignment, and try to work out a solution. This autobiographical approach is one that I unintentionally and clumsily used when teaching in Allegheny County Jail. Oftentimes, these were simply prompts that asked students to tackle difficult issues, such as their relationships with the often white correctional officers. Now, as an instructor of basic writing, introductory college writing, and community writing with the center, I am more intentional with my curriculum. For example, it's important to note, as I'm sure you have noticed, that I am a white man and must wrestle with the implications of my various privileges when bringing counterstory to my students. Someone who does this to great effect is Frankie Condon, most famously in I Hope I Joined the Band, Narrative, Affiliation, and Anti-Racist Rhetoric. Although she is a white woman, Condon uses counterstory to be an accomplice and unpack issues of white privilege and allyship. So now I'll be kind of relating this scholarship to the basic writing classroom, which is where Julian and I met. Since its inception in the 1970s, basic writing, or developmental writing as it's sometimes called, has occupied a central place in composition sequences across the country. Carceral logics in the prison system may go without saying, but scholars and teachers of basic writing have also described this classroom as a bordered space, one where students who are most at risk of losing their position in the university are served by the instructors who are lowest in the hierarchy of university management. Scholars such as Deborah Mutnick in Writing in an Alien World, Basic Writing and the Struggle for Equality in Higher Education, have referred to this classroom as a borderland, quote unquote, because it is often taught by contingent labor, adjuncts, graduate teaching assistants such as myself, and peopled by aliens, minorities, and working class people who need to be assimilated into the university. Thus, basic writing has occupied some of the more potent debate in composition studies for reasons that Mutnick summarizes. Quote, although basic writing is obviously not synonymous with racial and class subordination, it arises from the same structural and historical inequalities, and its position in the academy reproduces the same hierarchical arrangements of insider, outsider, marginal, and mainstream status. However, basic writing has also evolved into a course that provides genuine support to students outside the mainstream, just as affirmative action, equal opportunity, and other entitlement programs have done, and consciously analyzes the marginality of both students and teachers. Essentially, basic writing arose from the need for the university to remediate new students who didn't fit into traditional notions of what a university student should be: white, upper class, male, straight, etc. However, despite its reactionary formation, many scholars have called for its defense for the reason Mutnick outlines above. Those on the margins can come together to support one another, write, and think through issues they might not otherwise have had the opportunity to discuss. Clearly, this classroom space does have radical potential, and abolitionists researching institutional histories and ethnic studies offer compelling suggestions for how to engage these spaces and resources to progressive ends. In the reorder of things, the university and its pedagogies of minority difference, Roderick Ferguson, an abolitionist educator and scholar, writes a history of universities in the United States. His work highlights how, as a more diverse group of people have fought their way into the university, their struggles have been co-opted and drained of their radicalism to meet the goals of codification, explanation, and definition. Ultimately, Ferguson's call to fight this development echoes one made by June Jordan in her 1969 article, Black Studies, which is that cultural and ethnic studies departments should be parasitic and use the university's resources for other forms of learning and subjectivity. Essentially, ethnic and cultural studies departments should exploit the university for their own ends. While Ferguson highlights ethnic studies departments, basic writing instructors may also exploit the meager resources allocated to us to create a beachhead for more radical work. And in my case specifically, use the classroom to further benefit my students and the Center for Latino, Latina, and Latin American Studies. As a basic writing instructor, I do my best to forward an abolitionist teacherly position and work towards solidarity between myself and my students. This is unique to basic writing instructors, as many of us are at the lowest rung of university management. As I said before, we're graduate teaching assistants, lecturers, adjuncts, things like that. And we have more in common with our students than we might realize, more opportunities for solidarity than the average tenured college professor. And in order to start thinking through these loftier goals of solidarity and action, I think it's important to begin this journey through teaching Counterstory. So in the Counterstory below, I will work through some of these issues with an autobiographical reflection of my own experiences as a white man, teaching in Allegheny County Jail and teaching basic writing for the center. Since I have taught Counterstory to my basic writing students, we'll also hear from Julian, who took basic writing with me last summer and wrote a particularly compelling autobiographical reflection that covers many of the same themes as my writing. And I just want to point out, this was his first draft, okay? So prepare to be impressed. It was his first draft and it's crazy good. Unfortunately, we cannot hear from someone named M, who is one of my students in Allegheny County Jail and who I did not obtain permission from for a Counterstory. This following Counterstory is framed through theories of abolition, hegemonic whiteness, and racial permanence. It subscribes to several tenets of critical race theory, including a challenge to dominant ideologies, the centrality of experiential knowledge and/or unique voices of color, a commitment to social justice, and accessibility. So now we'll get into the actual counter story itself. Walking into a jail sucks. There are usually about 5 correctional officers or COs leering at you as you walk through the metal detector. They go through all your stuff and you already feel like you've done something wrong. The COs are somehow both extremely bored and invasively attentive. God help you if you've left anything you're not supposed to have in your pockets. Even in this entryway, not even totally inside the jail yet, there's this smell that percolates through the whole experience, something like sawdust, Lysol, and BO. I already don't like elevators, and getting in the one that takes me down to my students in the basement education center rattles and shakes like it's on its last journey. Walking out into the basement, everything is bathed in this fluorescent yellow light. It's almost silent as I walk to my classroom. My footsteps echo through the halls. Every so often, there's a guy in orange doing custodial work or a woman in muted colors rushing with a clipboard somewhere. But usually, I am alone when I walk to the education center, alone when I enter it, and alone when I finally get to my classroom. There are no windows, 15 chairs that are too small, and a single whiteboard. I will use this space, paper, pencils, and some handouts to teach creative writing for the next 3 hours. I'm teaching basic writing for the Center for Latino, Latina, and Latin American Studies over the summer at Wayne State University in Detroit. I am a white dude and PhD candidate with only 2 years of university teaching under my belt, paid under $30,000 a year for the sections I teach, and work with students who I am often told are highly important to the makeup of the university, need the most resources, and require the most dedication from instructors. Supposedly, these are underprepared Latino, and Latinx students who need to be prepared before they start college for real. I've never met an underprepared student, and quite frankly, don't expect to, but apparently they're in my class this summer. These students will take an initial 6-week basic writing class with me as part of a stretch program when they enter the university. After basic writing, they'll be in introductory college writing with me in the fall. This section of basic writing is online because of COVID-19, and I'm trying to shove as much content as I can into an abbreviated 6-week class, which is not nearly enough time to learn anything. I read Counterstory, The Rhetoric and Writing of Critical Race Theory recently for my graduate studies, so I decided to make Counterstory through journal writing a major part of the class. Every week, the students write to prompts where I hope to get them thinking about things like structural racism, power, positionality, and writing. One week, I asked them these questions. What does it currently mean to be a citizen of the United States? What should it mean to be a citizen of the US? What should your privileges be if you are a citizen? What should your responsibilities be if you are a citizen? I'm 18 years old and a first-year student at Loyola University, Chicago. I'm partying on a Lake Michigan beach with some friends in one of the wealthy northern suburbs. The beach is private. We've lit an illegal fire. We're drinking underage. We're smoking marijuana. We're being loud. All of us are white. It takes several minutes for us to realize that 2 cops have sauntered up to our fire. They politely ask us to pour our beer over the fire, give one of my friends a ticket for marijuana possession, and send us on our way. We drive an hour back to Chicago drunk and high. The next weekend, we go back. Every week is different in Allegheny County Jail. Students are coming from different cell blocks and get called down in groups by a CO sitting in a desk down the hall. Our class starts right after count, when every single person in the jail is counted. Sometimes they mess up the count and my students don't come down for 15 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. Sometimes a cell block has gotten into trouble and gets locked down, meaning they must stay in their cells the entire day. Sometimes the CO decides he wants his lunch break to go a bit longer and refuses to call them down until he's had his lunch. Somewhere between 3 and 15 students usually come down in 1s and 2s. The CO keeps an eye on us the entire time and will occasionally pull students out with no explanation to send them up to their cell blocks. In my basic writing class, Julian is a young Puerto Rican man and clearly a talented writer. Despite basic writing being an online asynchronous class, we've connected through our mutual love of creative writing. Julian has told me he's working on a memoir about his life in high school. We frequently correspond via email about music, writing, and the collegiate experience. When I ask Julian to respond to the citizen prompt, this is what he writes.
I'm just setting everything up. This week I received my first traffic ticket. I've been driving clean for 2 years. I'm also not the type to drive recklessly at all. The civil infraction that I did was just a little mistake that I made. I missed a stop sign at Allen Park and a police officer pulled me over. I looked at my colored hands as I keep my hands on the steering wheel to show that I'm not a criminal or armed as the police officer steps out of his vehicle. As my hands are on the steering wheel, I notice my palms are white, but the back of my hands in contrast are caramel brown. They're half rinsed. I can't get away with driving recklessly. My skin color results in fingers pointing at me in the wrong way, no matter where I'm at. I'm lucky. Some fingers pointed at other colored men end up to be gun barrels or knees on their neck. I've had police bark at me before. I've been patted down before. I've been shoved in the back of police cars before. I've had 4 police cars pulled up on me before. I've had school officers keep their eyes on me more than any other of my fair-skinned peers before. But a traffic stop was new this time. I just kept my hands on the steering wheel as Master leaves the squad car and slowly approaches my window. He's blonde, with sunglasses and a navy blue baseball cap. I get a good look at his face, and his complexion is like mine. Pores are non-existent. Still has that teenage adult, young adult youth to his face. He's a kid like me, and he shouldn't be any younger than 25. He's so young, in fact, that he looked like he could have went to high school with me. He probably just graduated high school when I was just entering it. I passed him my license and registration, and he takes a look at my rearview mirror accessory. It's a pair of boxing gloves painted red, white, and blue, the colors of the Puerto Rican flag, with Puerto Rico stamped it onto the gloves. I bought the gloves when I was last in Puerto Rico in June to show off my pride to my country. He takes my information, goes to his car, comes back. After a good 15 minutes waiting on the officer as he processes my information, he comes back and passes me a ticket. He says, "You passed the stop sign. That's a civil infraction, so I'm going to have to ticket you." I'm furious at this time. I waited 15 minutes for this nonsense. I had to drive 30 minutes to work, and now I have to let this officer, who isn't much older than me, ego boost himself as he passes me a $150 ticket with a smile on his face. I plead, "Listen, officer, I'm 18 years old. I've been driving since I was 15. I don't have not a single point on my license, a single ticket in my record. And I'm making myself drive to work so I can pay off my college. I didn't mean to do it, and I won't do it again. Is there a way that you can leave me off with a warning?" The officer, with a voice that has a higher pitch than mine, says, "Nah, see, I could, but I also could tow your car right now for this. I can classify you as a reckless driver. If you didn't stop while another car was passing by, you could have hit and killed somebody." We were on an empty side street. There was not a single car in sight. I didn't see no car that I hit, and I for sure didn't see no person on the road that I killed. I looked at him and realized he could ruin my day by just towing my car. So I just took the ticket and drove off. I think about the stories that my white friends tell me as I drive to work about how they get pulled over for going 50 miles over the speed limit. Then the officer sees an 18-year-old white kid that has the same fare scare as them. Those officers don't see no Puerto Rican boxing gloves hanging over their rearview mirror, and my friends get out of their speeding ticket with a warning. But me, I missed the stop sign in an empty street, and I'm being told that I could have my car towed. I'm going to head to work after being pulled over in work for 8 hours just so I can use that money that I worked hard for to pay off that $150 ticket. That officer wasn't much older than me either. His fair skin and his way of looking down on me reminds me of how they did in high school. In high school, they were older than me at that time, just like the officer who ticketed me. They used their fair skin as an advantage to put down others and associated me as stereotypes. They talked to me in a tone of respect, but disrespect at the same time. I was their friend, but I was also below them. I was just different. And I didn't mean to be different. I was just half rinsed. That same tone from my high school experience in Allen Park, I received from the Allen Park police officer this week. It angered me. I imagine those small red, white, and blue boxing gloves hanging on my rearview mirror. They're no bigger than the palm of my hand, growing in size and using it to beat down that kid in a uniform. That officer wasn't a man in a uniform. He was a kid like me. I was just sick of hearing that tone again. It triggered violence in me, but being violent also just continues my stereotype. But being quiet also continues my stereotype as well. I don't know what to do. When I was 15 in my second year of high school, I remember one night I looked at myself in the mirror and I hated my skin color. I hated it. I was sick of the tone and voice I was receiving all day. It was that respect and that disrespect at the same time that infuriated me. When I was born and until the age of 10, my European genetics made me as white as it could be. When I was 10, I was white like my friends, like the police officers who pat me down and stare, like my cousins who are white passing Puerto Ricans. But it wasn't until the age of 12 where my African and my Taino genetics kicked in and I changed to be half rinsed. 15-year-old me shook his head and he just wanted to be white again. He just wanted that last name that was easy to pronounce. He was just sick of it. My little brother, he's 4. He's entering kindergarten this year and he's half rinsed like me. And he's going to have to deal with that tone of voice for the next 14 years. He's going to have teachers and classmates look at him like if he's a monkey in student clothing, just like how his big brother received that treatment. He's going to get pulled over just like his big brother, and he's going to be patted down and shoved in police cars just for standing outside at night like his big brother. At the Allen Park Street Fair today, my mother and my little brother passed by a tent of army soldiers who are looking to recruit some new people. And my mother, she looks at me and whispers in a joking manner to me. She says, "They might want to recruit you. You have a lot of muscle on. You look strong." And I laugh and I continue, and then a quote from Muhammad Ali plays in my head. When reporters asked him in the 60s if he would join the fight in Vietnam, since Muhammad Ali got drafted to fight there, Muhammad Ali responded with, "Why would I put on a uniform and fly 10,000 miles to Asia to fight and kill brown people if the US government doesn't fight for brown people's rights here?" Keep that quote to myself. I don't say it to anybody else, not even my mom. And I smile under my face mask as I find that quote relatable to this day. When it comes to people asking me what it means to be a citizen today, it feels like what I meant to be as a citizen is to be treated below others. On my shoulders, I carry statistics and stereotypes wherever I go. I don't care about government policy or role or party because those policies and rules aren't built for me. They don't help me. The police who pull me over and talk me down and bark don't care about me. And neither sometimes do the people who protest about the police either. Those organizations who protest the change on how my life matters and how I should be viewed differently as a citizen have been silent. Those organizations just collect their clout and attention from the media, then receive money and funding, then disappear. Those protests are for the money, not for me. There's no change, and it seems like there never will be. I'm going to hold my little brother's half-rinsed hands as I send him off into the world to be treated the same way as I did, to be treated below others, to be talked down, to feel like a monkey in citizen clothing. There is no policy, no organization, no president that can change that. Nothing can lift the statistics and stereotypes from my shoulders. No bill can be introduced to change the way that people look at me. I, as a US citizen, and my society will carry the right to continue wishing that I was white. What it means to be a citizen for me is to be quiet, receive the same tone of disrespect and respect at the same time, pay my tickets and go on with my day. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. So M is an older Black woman who struggles with drug addiction, which has forced her in and out of jail for several years. She is also a leader in our class, always encouraging the other women to share their stories and their poems. Despite my never assigning homework, She asks for an assignment every week, works on it, and then dutifully turns it in. At the end of this semester, we publish a book of poetry and have our students share their work in the chapel on the first floor of the jail. We also announce a star student who gets a certificate. When I announce M at the ceremony, she is crying when she comes up to accept her award. When she tries to hug me, I have to hold my arms directly up to the sky as 4 correctional officers forcefully yell, "No touching," at this show of closeness. It's the last time I see M. I have a conference with Julian after he shares his response to the citizenship prompt. I tell him how impressed I was with his writing, and we end up having a larger conversation about citizenship, racism, and the police. I share some of my experiences with him too, a kind of verbal counterstory. At the end of our conference, I feel something more important has happened than me teaching him anything, but the beginning of a much stronger bond, a kind of solidarity created through the sharing of mutual experiences. I may not have had the same experiences with the police, but we can both agree something isn't right with our differing experiences. This is the beginning of the real conversation, what we can do to change it. So now just kind of getting into some conclusionary thoughts here. Definitely still a work in progress. This is the least developed section, so bear with me. In Counterstory, the rhetoric and writing of critical race theory, Martinez draws on 4 quadrants of resistance, as detailed by Daniel Solorzano and Terrayoso in Examining Transformational Resistance Through a Critical Race and Lat-Crit Theory Framework, Chicana and Chicano Students in an Urban Context. According to Solorzano and Yoso, resistance is defined by 2 axes: how much or how little social oppression is critiqued, and how motivated or not motivated it is by social justice. The ideal form of resistance is transformative resistance, which has a solid critique of social oppression and is motivated by social justice. On this, Martinez says, the work of Counterstory as method, including the various genres of counterstory I have composed for this project, illustrate a rhetoric of transformational resistance. Instead of choosing to leave the academy, which at this moment in my career would fall in the quadrant of self-defeating resistance, or only offering suggestions pertaining to the way minoritized people can better prepare themselves for assimilationist success in higher education, which would represent conformist resistance, I choose to resist through a project that, through Counterstory, critiques the systems in place and is founded on the belief of individual and social change. The work of Counterstory is the work of transformational resistance. As we labor toward the material changes of open admissions, universal free college, funding ethnic studies departments, and so on, we may simultaneously bring approaches like Counterstory to our classrooms. So I sense in Martinez's work an exhortation for the mainly white people who overwhelmingly control our profession to read her book, along with other CRT methodology and theory, and then bring some of these curricular changes to our students, who are also mostly white. In contrast, I am a white person who read this book, but in turn taught Counterstory to my Latino, and Latinx students, which is actually very easy for me because obviously, as you just heard, my students don't need me to tell them about how racism has impacted their lives. Instead, teaching them with this method gives respect to the things my students are experts in, their own lives. It allows a safe space for all of us to tell our stories and begin the process of something that can be truly transformational, which is solidarity. When oppressed people put their heads together and talk about their shared oppression, the result is the beginning of this solidarity, the seed of trying to achieve something together. Ultimately, this is my goal as an abolitionist through teaching Counterstory in the classroom. It's one tool I use to try and overcome the education survival complex, build solidarity, and allow my students to thrive rather than just survive. Thank you.
So if you have any questions or comments, raise your hand using the reactions button in the bottom right corner. Or you should be able to leave a question in the chat.
Hi, everyone. It's just a comment. I have to say it was really moving to hear, one of our first year students, Julian, I think it was so brave of you to share your story, and Elia as well. I think just my experience working with Elia, discussing student cases and seeing how you're implementing this sort of approach with students is fascinating to watch. I'm very interested in, how the other students are receiving this information. I'm just moved. I really am. It was wonderful to see, and thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
You think Elena wants to comment?
I'm sorry, I'm so low tech. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just a terrific job. I'm so happy to have been able to hear this. Thank you, Elia and Julian, for really excellent work. I want to say that the thing that is so troublesome to me as I listen to, that just breaks my heart every day, is that locally and regionally and nationally, we have no avenue of redress. There is just no avenue of redress. And when Julian talked about no amount of legislation and no amount of anything will basically remove this burden from off of his shoulders, and think about the amount of money, the little amount of money that we earn and the high amount of money that we pay in fines and taxes. He basically paid the Puerto Rican tax. And it was the terrible injustice associated with that. And looking at the broader picture of like what happened in Grand Rapids, and look at how many, how traffic, how cars, how transportation, and the limiting of movement, the limiting of or the imposing of enclosure. If you look at the role of transportation, auto insurance, police profiling, and how it not only adds to, it creates this incredible inequality in the amount of money that people can hold, and the amount of, or how far you can go, the transportation issues, but also you'll just be seen and profiled, and there isn't anything that you can do about it. Any move that you make can get you killed, but you have to pay this fine, and you did nothing wrong. And that, to me, that's the lack of any avenue of redress is what's so heartbreaking about that story that he tells. And it's something that you see across, particularly across Michigan, but it's the recent increase in auto insurance that was billed as a reform, which created a much greater level of inequality, and how that affects our students, and how long we see people waiting for buses that are not going to come. Just the whole idea of the freedom of movement and the cost, the tax on some over others is something that Julian really, it really moved my heart to hear him tell it. And I really appreciate the counter story, but that's actually the story.
Nobody brought that up. Well, they don't remember. I mean, because I looked to see, because when I was calling.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that. And I think that's why this approach is so important, because I don't really know, like maybe in a more traditional basic writing classroom or traditional writing classroom where Julian might have had the space to like even talk about that and feel open enough to talk about it in the way that he talked about it, right?
Mhm.
To be so, I mean, it's so honest, and I
Mhm.
think that is why I really advocate for this approach. So thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah, and bouncing off of that, it just felt really good to just like have a class that was able to challenge me and just talk about real life things. Because when you really think about English classes when it comes to high school or like college, they usually make you do like a research paper about something that you really don't care about, something that doesn't happen to you, something that you don't relate about, you know, and to really go and open up my computer the same week where I get the traffic ticket, and then the question is like, boom, like, you know, how does it feel like to be a citizen? And like you're already upset from that, and you could really channel what you feel in real life and put that into your academics. It was great, you know, and that's why I really like, especially about the center, about what we do, is because we challenge, and we, you know, I'm learning from writing, and we also do other stuff where we go into like history and then like past protests and stuff like that. I'm learning, but not only that, I'm also applying things that's happening to me every day and that I'm passionate about. So that's just what I really like about that, because you don't really get this. You don't really get this. I would have never in any other class had the time to really go and rant about this. I remember when I submitted this paper, there was a comment and I just put rant because I was just mad, you know? So yeah.
Walter Lucan had his hand up for quite a while.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, cool. So I have a question for both Elia and Julian. I guess what I'm curious to hear slightly more about is, how do the two of you imagine the kind of issues from the paper that you presented today interfacing with larger public conversations that are even kind of taking place like outside of the university? And what I mean by that specifically is that what I find is that if within the disciplinary conversation of ethnic studies or rhetoric and writing, I find that there's a certain dynamic where people are familiar with the institutional stuff a lot of the times, particularly in rhetoric and writing. I think Elia and I run up against this. Like basically people understand institutionally how different aspects of literacy and pedagogy like work within a university context, but they don't always think about how they're connected to like larger social problems. So I guess I'd be curious to hear how the two of you understand that relationship in particular.
So what was really interesting is that when it comes to conversations like this, when we talk about race or just our past experiences, like what's really interesting is that this is just stuff that naturally happens to us. This is our life. Just like how you have like a story and you relate to it. It was just very interesting how these things kind of come naturally, because this is stuff that happens in real life and everyday situations, not just Elia and I, just in general. You know, everyone has everyone can see the problems that are in our world, and we can really talk about it. So what I'm trying to say is that it just came out naturally, that my story just came out. Hey, this is what happened to me. Then Elia's like, oh, really? Like that's interesting because this happened to me in a different way. So when it comes to stuff like that, it's just how life just brings it all together, and how it just happens to everybody, and we could just talk about it, you know?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great point, Julian. And I think, well, what you're talking about, something that you just got me thinking about was just that. I think whether you're inside of the university or outside of the university, a lot of what we experience is kind of mediated through like social media, or through things we see on TV or things that we see on our computer. Like I'm thinking about this issue specifically, like talking about policing, right? And I think a lot of people see policing through the lens of what happened in the summer of 2020. And their opinions are formed around what you thought about the protests and whatever happened with that, right? But what I really value about this, and I think is applicable just for people across the board, is like, well, hold on a second. Let's take a step back from like what we've seen and witnessed like on a screen or whatever. And let's get back to like, well, what have our interactions with the police been on an individual level? And what are the similarities and differences between those experiences? And regardless of whether you're inside having a disciplinary conversation or you're out just like a person, that's a place you can work from to try and do something, rather than thinking about like, well, hey, I saw the protests and the protesters did this, that, and the other thing. It's like, well, hold on, what were the actual, let's hear about the actual experiences of the interactions with the police. So I don't know if that gets at your question at all, but that's kind of what I'm thinking about.
Lester?
Hi, thank you. What a treat to hear this. Thank you, Elia. Thank you, Julian. I just wanted to make a quick comment, and then it would lead to my question. So when we envisioned the stretch course model going from the summer all the way through the whole academic year with our students, we were thinking, okay, teach, critical writing, like the critical skills of writing, right? Of writing, composition, all of that. And also, help them fulfill their gen ed requirements, by the end of their first year, which is, helps them with momentum in the, in their progression to graduation. But, just to see the possibilities and the results that, of this year is amazing, and how, agreed with Estenia, how Elia really creates content that excites the students and that's meaningful to the students, just like Julian just mentioned as well. I'm just wondering, we have so few English majors. I just wonder, like, if, maybe this is just what we can do to encourage more of that writing is power. And even Julian, I know you're a psych major, but have you considered switching over to English, or, because it would be nice to develop young leadership in the field of English and have PhDs, Puerto Rican, Chicano PhDs graduating and then leading these conversations as well, these courses. So I guess it's a question, comment.
No, I feel you. Well, I always like psychology, always like learning things and just like learning like how people behave. And I think that really, like, what I learned in psychology also helps me learn about, I guess, real life and like how people see things or how people treat other people. So I'm not sure about English major, but I do really like writing. I like ranting. I love telling stories. Like the best way that you could really bond with people is to share experiences with each other and communicate and just meditate on that. So when it comes to, from what you asked, is that how can we continue pushing this for all students, either like inside the SAP program or outside, is just get them to talk about stuff that they're passionate about. One time I was in class, in Elia's class, and I think Dr. Cuello, and then she's here, and Senora Herrada as well. And it was funny because everyone was talking about, we were talking about just that same stuff, like reform or just stuff that people don't like. And the students were kind of quiet because they didn't know what to talk about. And then I think it was Elia that said it. He was like, so guys, what's just stuff that irritates you in society? And everyone just started talking.
Well, Julian, what I said was, what pisses you off? That was what I asked.
I didn't want to snitch on him, but he's
I appreciate you not snitching on me.
He looks at the students. He's like, guys, what's pissing you off in this world? And then everyone went from being quiet, not knowing what to say. They just start talking. And it's just, everyone is a writer when you ask them something that they're passionate about. So that's just the thing, like that was the trigger, if you were to tell me that I was going to write that paper, I wouldn't, if Elia told me write a 3-page paper about this and that, I would have been like, whatever. I would basically, excuse my French, but half-assed it. But when Elia just said, what is, the question was something around the lines of like, what does it feel like to be a citizen? That triggered me a lot more than just that. So it's just getting at things that can fire you up. So yeah.
Well, Jose, you have the last word.
Yeah, just briefly, this is a very effective method of teaching at this level because it centers the lesson in the student's individual identity. And even if you're in a class of 30, every single one of them is talking about their own identity. But then the bigger challenge is, what do you do with that? What do you do with that method that I'm assuming that this class had an impact on them, that they will keep at least part of this method of self-reflection and telling my counter story. But then how do you connect it to actually motivation about learning about topics, as Julian was saying, things that don't directly relate to their experience, but is important to their development? How do you get them to understand the systems that exist and the ways that it oppresses people instead of just their own individual oppression? And then get them to address the larger issues, not just their simple evasion of a cop or an authority figure. So it's just a comment.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think that might be something that I'll be wrestling with for the rest of my academic life, and maybe Julian as well. But I do really think that like the next step, in my view, is finding ways for these moments where students are composing these counter stories or composing things that they are passionate about, finding a way for them to share them with each other and build that into some kind of action from the classroom. Like particularly in, especially since it's a stretch course and these students are with me for several semesters, having that build toward some kind of action, some kind of actionable thing. But I haven't totally gotten there yet, but I appreciate that question because that really guides me. You know, how can we take that next step toward doing something positive?
Well, that realization that they're a collective is very important that
Yes.
you're doing. And then part of the step that you are very well aware of is because you read all the essays, you can probably see patterns. You can see patterns of interest, or what pisses them off and what actually helps them, etc. So you can actually identify patterns, and then the individual can identify with those patterns. So that's just it is a tough. You've chosen it's excellent stuff, because what you're doing here with the classroom is what I'm doing in historiography, telling the story of nomads that were colonized by Europeans, and then so I have to come up with counter stories at that level. So that method can be applied to many instances, not just your individual experience.
All right.
Yep.
Thank you so much. This was a very rich conversation about many things, much needed. And it shows that you can get wisdom from a variety of people. Out of the mouth of babes comes wisdom. And we had an undergraduate and a graduate student educating us about these important issues. Of course, I sense the influence of josecuello on some of these ideas. Somehow I think that he is the sort of master in this arena, and might have been inspiring some of your work. So thank you all. And Jacqueline usually has a little spiel at the end of these talks, and I invite her to do that right now.
I definitely think this was a treat, especially as one of our last brown bag talks of the semester. So I thank you both for participating in this program and for talking about a variety of issues you see within the academy and decolonizing the academy. That's a very important topic. And so I really appreciate that from you both. The Humanity Center wanted to thank you by gifting you with a caddy with our logo on it, as well as a mask. And I will reach out to you via email to see how we can get that to you. As for the rest of you, thank you for coming. And if you do want to give a brown bag talk yourself next year, the applications are open. So you can just send me an email and we can get you signed up. Have a great rest of your week or a great rest of your day. And we do have a brown bag talk tomorrow. So I hope to see you return. Bye-bye.
Bye.